because if you have people left behind without any prospects of being able to improve their lot in life, in other words, with no social mobility, then that creates real conflict. Yeah, all right. All right.
So people really enjoy these conversations that we're having.
Okay.
The man who's been helping me with the squirrels in my roof has listened to them.
Okay, fantastic. Okay. I'm glad someone is listening.
But he's worried that we don't have a good relationship, so maybe we can act more friendly towards each other.
He's worried about what?
In this conversation.
He's worried about what? Say that again.
That we don't have a very good relationship based on the way we speak to each other.
Oh, that's your fault. Okay. You need to be nicer to me. The young person has to be nicer to the old person, okay?
I am being nice.
Okay, come on.
Okay, so so I sent you a message saying, could we do another podcast? And the conversation may cover topics such as, why do you think socialism is a bad idea? Why do you think education is important? Are free markets good? And to what extent? What do you think about the family being, quote, the best social welfare system you'll ever have, which is something Gideon Rosner said when I did a podcast with him. Where did you develop your firm belief in individual accountability? Why is free thinking and free speech important? What do you think of the US trying to spread democracy at gunpoint? That's another one from Gideon. And how do we help people who are left behind by creative disruption? Because that's how we left the last podcast as well, with a question about globalization. You saying you could explain that another time.
Yeah.
And you said that you do have a view on all those issues.
Yeah.
So where would you like to start?
Where would you like to start?
Maybe with socialism.
Fine. Okay. So tell
what's
us,
the best way?
Are we recording it?
Well, what's the best way? Yeah, we are.
So, yes, Delia.
What's the best way to run a... Sorry, go on.
Well, I'm just saying good morning to you and welcome.
You're doing an introduction.
This is our third podcast together between father and daughter. So, hello, listeners, and let's hope we can make this interesting for you. So I think the first question you want to ask me, Delia, if I'm correct, is about what my views on socialism.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and I must say I'm very, I'm very negative on socialism. I don't think it's consistent with either sort of economic prosperity or libertarian values, including freedom of speech and freedom of association and all of the other freedoms that we enjoy in a democratic country. So, and I think the problem with socialism, in terms of and economic prosperity, and I think there's been enough data now on the comparing the various economies that have been subject to a socialist system and those that have been subject to more a market-based free enterprise system, is that it's pretty clear that the free enterprise system outperforms the socialist system, and you only have to look at the greatest example of that is probably the US vis-a-vis the USSR, and in the post-war period, and it is I can't remember the statistics offhand, but the GDP per capita growth in the US eclipsed that in the USSR by some multiples, and essentially that's all down. It's all really down to that of a market-based free enterprise system enables the creative juices to flow, and it sort of facilitates innovation and creativity and the productivity growth that comes from that. And on that point, we should just note Professor Paul Krugman's famous quote that in the productivity isn't everything, but in the long run, it is almost everything. And you get productivity not only by capital investment but by innovation. And the problem with socialist systems, which they remove the incentives and the rewards for both hard work and for innovation and creativity, and that's why generally as those economies perform far less well than market-based economic systems. You then get into you can then go beyond that into the other collateral stuff which comes from with socialist systems, which is usually some form of totalitarianism or autocracy. They tend to be fellow travellers, and they don't brook. They don't brook any. The leaders don't brook any dissent by and large, and they certainly don't. They don't have. There's a struggle to find either the rule of law or any the freedoms we normally associate with democratic countries. As I think about it, I mean, one of the best examples of why socialism is a poor economic model is given by Venezuela, and I can remember the figures broadly. So under Hugo Chavez as president of Venezuela, it was a very socialist country, and I think he might have been the leader for I'm guessing, but 20 years or something like that. And there's over the period of his leadership, their GDP declined, measured in US dollars, but it declined by 99%. And that's right, that's the number, 99%. And so his socialist system of government drove the economy into the ground and made it the poorest country in South America. So is that enough on socialism, Delia?
Well, can you explain why GDP is important?
Well, GDP per capita, I mean, it's just a measure of, it's sort of a measure of income per capita, and basically, and therefore the means by which individuals in any nation can acquire the goods and services they need or want to live a fulfilling life. So if you're from a prosperous country like most countries in the West, whether it's the US, the UK where you are at the moment, or Australia where I am, and we've got the ability to afford very good housing, high quality schooling, expensive cars, travel overseas on holidays to remote places, have a lot of help in the home, eat at expensive restaurants. The list goes on and on and on. Whereas if you're I don't think you enjoy any of those privileges in North Korea, for example. So just in terms of your the financial wherewithal to buy buy the goods and services that are consistent with a high standard of living. So that's so equate GDP per capita with standard of living. And I think you also goes on to medical. I should also put medical care in there as well. And I think you'll find that those countries with a greater GDP per capita, by and large, have greater quality of life, and by and large, we'll put a qualifier on this in a moment, greater longevity. By which I mean life expectancy. The qualifier, of course, is that seems to have turned a bit in certain countries, including the US, where because of obesity, amongst other things. But by and large, that is why GDP per capita is important.
Well, the US, isn't that because they don't look after the people who are falling behind? So that's what I want to ask next. To what extent do you have safety nets? Or how do you help those who aren't lifted up by the rising tide?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, because I think in different countries have different, let's call it sort of market-based economies, and sort of democratic countries have different approaches to that. So the US is probably at one extreme, where there's not a secure safety net for those who are less able or are subject to unfortunate socioeconomic circumstances, and don't have the and we'll come to education at some point, but don't get the benefit of a great education and the opportunity that provides. So the US doesn't have as secure a safety net, and as a result of that, there is a greater disparity in or greater inequality in incomes, and therefore standards of living in the US, compared to, say, the UK, and certainly compared to Australia, where Australia is much more egalitarian, and because we do have we've got a better set of let's call it government provided benefits for those who are less able, or who are in disadvantaged circumstances. And why is that important? Well, I think I'll give you in the end, economies tend to do better on the whole if there is cohesion, and everyone buys into the values that of the nation, and the principles by which the economy is run. So in Australia, we had a change of government in an election in May, from a Conservative government, which had ruled for 9 years, to a let's call it a Labor government, and that occurred without any riots in the streets. And unfortunately, in the US, and this is really a concern that many observers and commentators have about the US system in the US, there is a great fracture, really, between between the Republicans and their supporters, and the Democrats and their supporters. And we saw one manifestation of that in what was it, January of last year, 2021, when the with the the finalization of the results of the presidential election, which Trump lost and Biden won, and we had the storming of the Capitol building and all the violence and some deaths that were associated with that, and there's a lot of one can argue that a lot of the sort of the cleavage in the US between the progressives and the right is driven by income inequality and the lack of a safety net, and therefore that really militates against social cohesion. So I think that's a long-winded answer, but I think, Delia, I think it's very important for social cohesion. A safety net is very important for social cohesion, because if you have people left behind, then if it's a significant proportion of the population that gets left behind, and you have a big and without any prospects of being able to improve their lot in life, in other words, with no social mobility, then that creates real conflict, which is can be evident in crime rates, and beyond that, it can actually be ultimately it's a path for some form of political revolution. And those who study revolutions, the Russian Revolution and the French Revolution, a lot of it is to do with a massive cleavage between a privileged few and a large underclass.
Going back to what you said about expensive cars and expensive restaurants, is that really that important? Do you think you're saying that because you didn't have access? I remember you telling me that you never ate in a restaurant in your entire childhood or something like that. And is that just you're saying that because you can clearly see how the system has changed your life in that specific way?
No, you're just asking why is GDP per capita important? As I was just explaining that the higher the GDP per capita, the higher the standard of living, and the more stuff that you can buy and experiences you can enjoy, and and quality education and quality healthcare that you can access. That's all.
Yeah, because I guess my point on that is, do we need more stuff? Do people need more? Like, why do you need an expensive car? But,
well, you don't. But people. But it's up to. Does it improve quality of life? Yes, is a very good question. Probably not. Nevertheless, I mean, it's part, and I think you'll find that higher quality cars, let's put it that way, it's sort of a part and parcel of a higher standard of living. So if you go to a poor country, you're not going to see, apart from the elite rulers, you won't see too many people, sort of ordinary citizens driving around in sort of Mercedes, for example. But whereas in London, where you are, and here in Melbourne, there are a lot of Mercedes on the road. To use that, not to particularize that brand, but what I'm just using it to illustrate the point.
Yeah, I guess in Germany you have ordinary people driving Mercedes, but yeah, I get the point. But I guess for me, the idea there that you didn't mention is about freedom. If you have a government, you could say socialism or communism, where the government's making sure everyone is fed, but you don't get to choose what you're eating, or making sure everyone has transport, but you don't get to choose what color car you want, for example.
Yeah.
So maybe an expensive restaurant isn't important to someone, but it's the point. It's the idea that you have the choice of where to spend your money, and the government isn't telling you.
Yeah, but it's also that you can get, you've actually got greater spending power. I think that's the real point. I mean, you've got greater command of resources in a liberal democracy with a market-based economy, because it means that you're just more productive. So you can therefore, with your financial resources will command, a greater extent and greater quality of goods and services. So I think that's really the point. And you get a choice, and you choose. So you can buy more things, you can afford to buy more things. And B, you can actually have a great deal of you have a free choice as to what you buy. So they go hand in hand, basically. I think you'll find that sort of high, liberal democracies with market-based economies tend to have the benefits of both higher standard of living and some basic freedoms.
Yeah. So the pie is bigger as well.
Yes. Yeah.
It's just not divided evenly, whereas communism, it's a smaller pie because people can't be creative, people can't innovate.
Well, it's smaller.
The incentives aren't there.
The incentives aren't there. It's a smaller pie, and inarguably, it's divided even more unequally. One would argue, because the elite, look at there's a narrower band of elite who do get sort of a very high standard of living, and then you've got that's 1%, and then you've got 99% who are subjugated by and large. So, and one might look at Russia today and still argue, even though I don't know how you would describe it, it was a communist country, but it's sort of we could
oligarchy.
It's an oligarchy at the moment, and there's a huge disparity in wealth between the ordinary people and sort of the few dozen oligarchs who are beneficiaries of Putin and Yeltsin before him.
I think that you have to be careful with the healthcare argument, because that falls apart with places like Cuba, which is supposedly has one of the best healthcare systems under communism.
Yes, I think that's right. They have a lot of doctors, but they've got a very low standard of living. And it's a good. It's another example of the outcomes of they're actually communist, I suppose, but sometimes hard to distinguish. It's a shades of grey between true socialism and communism.
Well, what's your definition of true socialism versus communism?
Oh, I mean, is North USSR was Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. I mean, they called themselves socialists. Cuba probably, Castro was a communist. I don't think I think it's probably semantics. I mean, people say that some Northern European economies, like, the Scandinavian economies, are a bit socialist, but, government might have a higher and sort of a higher command, a higher proportion of GDP, but they're essentially market-based economies. In France, for example, government has a bigger share of the economy than, say, the UK, but I think you'd still say France is a market-based economy and a liberal democracy. So,
and the government share, is that through taxes?
essentially, yes.
So income
ownership,
taxes as well as corporate taxes.
and
Ownership.
value added and VAT, and also you would say that it would be and also ownership of state-owned enterprises. France has a much bigger proportion of state-owned enterprises as a proportion of the economy than, say, the UK, because they never went through the same privatisation that the UK did under Thatcher.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, when I was in the US, my American friends and colleagues would frequently tell me that Australia's socialist.
On what basis?
Because I guess their definition is more like if the government if you have a high minimum wage, or if there's some kind of healthcare provided, those are socialist things. Or if taxes, well, yeah, they would love to say that it's socialist because there's high taxes, and I would point out that the taxes are, like, the income taxes are pretty similar. It's just that in Australia, the taxes, or the UK, I guess the taxes go to making sure there's no holes in the roads, amongst other things, whereas in the US, you're still paying the same taxes, but I guess a lot of more of it is to military spending rather than looking after public infrastructure and stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, I don't think. Australia does have Australia has a better safety net than or a more secure, stronger safety net than the US, because we do have a high minimum wage, and we do have, we have Medicare, we have a universal healthcare system, and we have, we have a pretty relatively relative to the US particularly, we have better unemployment benefits. So yeah, we've got, but as I said before, that's important to provide that safety net, because it just means there's just more social cohesion. And the other thing we do is we probably have a better public education system. And I know you want to talk about education, but the one thing that education enables is social mobility. So that's why education is, one of the key reasons why education is important, is that it's a higher skilled workforce will productivity is very highly correlated with the level of education, average level of education in the working population. So if you want to have a wealthier or more prosperous, let's say, economy, then you've got to educate your people. It's fundamental. And the other, so that's an overall benefit, if you like, so education is a public good in that sense. But for the individual, education is really a passport to greater economic opportunity, particularly in a liberal democracy where there is social mobility. So so that's all, and that is also a way in which again that's also consistent with creating a higher standard of living, because if you educate people, then you give them the freedom to have the freedom to pursue their passions and to innovate and create, and to reap the rewards, financial and other, that come with innovation and creativity. Then they are they are helping power a higher level of productivity and therefore prosperity for the economy. But if you don't educate your people well, you are not only are you depriving individuals of the opportunity to advance themselves, but you're also condemning the nation as a whole to a lower level of productivity and therefore a lower standard of living. I mean, that's a very general set of statements, but those general principles hold.
So what does a good education system look like to you?
Oh, I think it looks like, I think, again, a good education system is, it's compulsory, and there's a little factoid that I think that for those listeners who don't know Australia, so Melbourne is the capital city of the state of Victoria, and Victoria was sort of initially a colony. I think it became a separate colony, maybe 1851, I think, from memory, and Australia was federated in 1901. Now, I think it was in maybe the 1870s. So the state, or wasn't a state, it was in a colony of Victoria, was the first the first state, let's say, in the world to make primary school education compulsory. Okay, now you don't normally associate compulsion with a liberal democracy, but there's a lot of compulsion. We all have to have rules and standards, and so the fact that so it was a great innovation. I mean, we also, for those overseas listeners, we're good on compulsion here in Australia because we have compulsory voting. We take democracy seriously, so seriously that you get fined if you don't vote. If you're on the voting roll. So to answer your question about education, it needs to be compulsory, particularly, and here in Victoria, I think it's compulsory from, let's say, prep age 5 through to sort of probably age 15. I think is the minimum school leaving age, and it's clearly encouraged. Your schooling beyond that's encouraged, and university is encouraged. So it needs to be compulsory. It needs to be affordable, and that's why the state has to provide primary and secondary education. And we have a funding scheme at university level where the fees are largely paid via. They're called income contingent loans, which is very clever system invented here in Australia about 30 years ago. So they're not sort of, so you only repay the loan to the extent of your income once you get in the workforce, unlike student loans in the US, for example. So compulsory, affordable, and high quality. They'd be my criteria for a good education system.
Do you think university should be encouraged for everyone?
No, I don't think, not for everyone, but some form of post-secondary school training, certainly for everyone. I mean, there are a lot of there's a lot of vocational training. If you think about the skills required for a modern economy, and I'll be a bit flippant here. We can't all have arts degrees. We need engineers. We need doctors. We need electricians. We need tradesmen. We need skilled electricians. We need plumbers. We need carpenters. We need bricklayers. We need IT specialists. A lot of those, I'm going to call it more vocational skills that I just ran through there, are not best conveyed in a university setting. They're better conveyed in, we call them here technical and further education colleges, or through an apprenticeship system. And it's sort of interesting. Germany, which is a great manufacturing nation, has one of the best sort of vocational skills-based systems in the world. And there isn't sort of, as there may be in in well, not so much Australia, maybe, and maybe in certain countries, maybe in the UK, for example, where I think trades are sort of viewed sort of as sort of being sort of inferior from a social perspective than sort of than university graduates. I mean, that in Germany that isn't the case at all. In fact, trades are highly valued and highly respected. So I'm answering so to answer your question, not everyone. It's not appropriate or necessary or desirable for everyone to do a university degree, but but certainly training, some form of training or education beyond year 12 is in modern economies where is most likely highly desirable for the benefit of, again, having a highly productive economy and a high standard of living. Because a lot of compared to 50 years ago, the need for the automation of tasks and including the automation of a lot of things means that there isn't the same need for untrained labour, and isn't the same need for a lot of what used to be basic clerical and basic administrative tasks. So automation now, it's where you get to the idea of creative destruction. Those sort of jobs don't exist anymore, but there are lots of other jobs that do exist and which require a higher degree of education or a more sophisticated set of skills, and it's all part and parcel of a more productive economy.
Like aged care, for example.
Well, how do you mean an aged care? Aged care.
Well, that's the example that's often used, that it's like, okay, these jobs aren't needed, but there are a lot more people needed, and that presumably will continue to rise, people working in aged care.
Yeah.
You need people in those jobs, not machines.
You need people in those jobs.
With aging populations.
Indeed. And they need to have, not only do they have to have the patience of Job, but they need to have skills, certainly, and particularly with the need for more registered nurses in aged care, for example.
What do you think of this tweet that someone sent me? The problem is not simply that capitalism produces too much, but that it produces the wrong stuff. SUVs, fast fashion, and planned obsolescence instead of public transit, affordable housing, and universal healthcare. It overuses resources and still fails to meet even basic needs.
Oh, well, I don't know about that it fails to meet basic needs. It probably does. I mean, yes. I mean, it does produce the problem of plenty, if you like. I mean, most Western countries have very high standard of living, as I said, and command a lot of resources. Now, some people, therefore, you can question the value of what those financial resources are used to buy. I would agree with that, but that's a matter of taste. But I guess the point is there is there is freedom of choice in that regard, and that's one of the results of people exercising their freedom of choice. In terms of public public sort of transit systems and so on. I think some of the most sophisticated systems in the world are in liberal democracies. Not so much in the US, but that's because the car sort of dominates. But certainly I know it's being upgraded, but the UK's got a pretty good public transport system. By and large, they're endeavouring to improve it with Crossrail, and I know there's a fast train to Birmingham and Manchester, I think, underway. But the public transit systems are really the preserve of government, and we know that around the Western world, government sort of have been lagging on infrastructure expenditure, and that's one of the big issues that need to be addressed in the next 10 to 20 years. So does that answer your
so
your
that
tweet?
that would be that guy's point. You said it's that, like, China, for example, has probably the best public transport.
Japan has a pretty good public transport system, I think. So,
but that's his point, is that capitalism isn't producing it.
Well,
that's what you just said. It's government.
It's government. Yeah, I mean, I think it's government priorities. We need the free enterprise, as I said, market-based economies. We still have a need for government. We can't because for a whole variety of things. Because there are things, it's sort of we need sort of to defend our country. We need to police the laws that we have, and there are a lot of there are a lot of public goods that we need. If someone's got to build and maintain the roads, I mean, we do need public transport systems. We need a court system. You go, and we need, as I've said, education. We need, by and large, I mean, it's a preserve of, because it's such an important public good. Education tends to be particularly primary and secondary, tends to be the preserve of government. So there's a lot of things that we need to have a properly functioning economy and society. We need government. We don't need more of it than we just don't. We just need it to do the important things, and the things that it doesn't need to do, we can leave to the free enterprise system. And where you draw that line is there's a lot of debate about exactly where you draw that line.
So why do you think public transport is important?
Why do you think public transport?
Some level of that.
Well, if you want to have these days there's been a lot of agglomeration of population in large cities, and the reality is, if you want to be able to get around in a city and between big cities, and being a free, the sort of freedom of movement in a physical sense is very, very, very important to productivity. I mean, you don't want to spend your life, hours each day stuck in a traffic jam. That's actually not conducive to productivity. So having good public transport infrastructure is critical to a highly productive society. So that's why it's important. And because it's a public good, by and large, and governments need to provide it.
Or in partnership with.
Oh, sure. There are different financing mechanisms and so on, but effectively it's got to be convened and led by government.
So I guess this is this tweet kind of shows the problem with when people take things from the US and adopt them as a global perspective, or try to adopt it to an Australian view, because those things, like, we do have universal healthcare in Australia. We do have this market-based economy with important, I guess, the socialist type things that people generally agree are important, like healthcare, education, all the things we covered.
Yep. Well, I think it's different. I think it's
that it's different to the US.
It's different. Yeah, I mean, we tend to have a and we're better for it. We've got higher quality infrastructure in Australia than in the US, and we're better for it, to be honest. So just the sort of having a properly functioning government doing what is necessary for the state to do is entirely consistent with a highly functioning market-based free enterprise economy and in a high and high standards of living. And not only Australia shows that, but Scandinavian countries show that. Probably Germany shows that. So there are a lot of countries around the world which demonstrate, which have the benefit of that. The US is probably a little bit, arguably, slightly. It's probably got relatively less government sort of role in the economy overall, probably measured by expenditure and taxes as a percentage of GDP, and arguably they might be. One might argue their overall quality of life might be better if they did have a slightly bigger role for government around providing essential services and essential infrastructure. But again, that's a debate one can have.
Mm-hmm. The UK point I didn't mention, and maybe I can get someone on this podcast to explain it, but that with the university, that seems to be a problem here, that after Tony Blair turned all the polytechnics into universities, and now there's a lot of people with university degrees that probably, that there's not enough jobs for those people. They probably didn't need to go to university, and now they have these loans and so on.
Yeah, that's possible. I'm not really, I'm not familiar with the details of that. Other than that, I think I'd observed that unemployment's pretty low in the UK at the moment. Not with probably as a result. Well, yeah, number of reasons. Brexit has probably contributed to that, with many of the continental Europeans going home. But that's a different matter.
What do you think about this idea? Someone told me, a friend mentioned this idea to me yesterday about how in Australia we have that system you were explaining with university where it's income, where you only start paying back your loans when you reach a threshold of income, and then it comes out in small amounts per year, and it's just linked to inflation, the interest rate. What do you think about having that system for welfare? For this friend, he was saying he should be paying back his youth allowance, the government support he got when he was younger. He's said, why shouldn't I be paying that back now as well, that I'm earning money? And maybe that's a better system, that people can accept money, welfare from the government when they need it, and then have kind of the dignity that they get to pay it back. Because, like, in the same way as university, it's like, okay, I've been helped out to get this so I can improve my life and earn income later, and then pay it back in small amounts. If I am able to reach a level of income.
That's possible, but I guess it just becomes it's another sort of administrative burden. I think the simple answer to that is that if you actually, I mean, we in Australia have got a pretty progressive income tax system, and we by and large, relative to other Western nations, we pay far too much income tax because our GST or value added tax is not as high is not as big a source of government revenue as in other countries. So I would say the answer to that, guy, is that if he got youth allowance, and as while he was studying at university, he's subsequently gone into the workforce and is earning a high income, he'll be paying a high amount of. He'll be paying, a material amount of taxes, and it probably will. I'd see that as the way that he's sort of repaying his the contribution he got from the government or the taxpayer, let's say, in the form of youth allowance.
Well, he lives overseas, so
well, there you are.
And he has always lived overseas.
Dear me. So he's sort of a free rider on the Australian taxpayer. So there are few of those around.
Yeah, well, that was me getting free university until they realised all these people overseas who never paid their uni loans back. Yeah, so you don't really have libertarian views or full market-based views at all.
I'm just realistic, because I just recognise that you've got to, when you look at sort of individual freedoms, they're in the context of a framework of the rule of law. We can't all decide to drive on whichever side of the road it takes our fancy in the morning. That would be chaos. And similarly, freedom of speech is subject to laws of defamation, and so on and so forth. So we've got to have, we need a framework within which we exercise our various freedoms, and similarly, when it comes to the functioning of the economy, we've got to acknowledge there are certain things which are public goods, which the market system won't provide, and climate change is an example of that. I mean, there are things called externalities, and carbon emissions are externalities, and they're certainly, it would appear, the science suggests they're contributing to a warming of the planet. And how do you address that? Well, frankly, you've got to sort of price the, economists will say, you price the externality, which is you put a carbon price on. Now, many, perhaps some strictly free market people might be aghast at that idea, but it's necessary to actually have a properly functioning global society, one would argue. So I think it's always freedom. There are we can't have total laissez-faire, because that just creates chaos and mayhem. So it's freedom and free enterprise, subject to sensible constraints. But within those constraints and supports, you let sort of the creativity blossom, and let people get the rewards of their hard work and innovation. And that's the way of driving the best sort of economic out. Probably the best, the highest level of prosperity, and the highest and the greatest degree of choice. So that's my philosophy, and I think Australia as a nation is a great exemplification of those principles and policies. And that's one of the reasons why we have such we've got one of the highest educated workforces in the world. We've got one of the highest standards of living in the world, and we, by and large, have a great great degree of personal freedom. Long may it continue.
Well, some would argue that last bit's up for debate after the last couple of years.
Absent, not during COVID, but absent sort of once in a century pandemic.
I guess all the rules with people would argue is there not being that much freedom, like having to wear a bike helmet and whatever. But yeah, I guess that will have to be a whole nother conversation then, which is how to help those people who are still left behind in a system like Australia's. Like, what's the solution?
Well, make sure they get a good education, and encouragement to use it, and that's probably that's the best thing you can do for anyone who's left behind. And then it's up. Then if you enable them to take advantage of opportunities, that means that's the best possible way to give them a hand up.
Okay, the last thing I want to ask you is so tomorrow I'm interviewing Chris Snowdon from the Institute of Economic Affairs, a UK free market think tank. And he has written this book recently called Killjoys. So the kind of blurb is: eating sugary food, drinking alcohol, and smoking cigarettes are legal activities, but politicians still use the law to discourage them. They raise their price, prohibit or limit their advertisement, restrict where they can be sold and consumed. These politicians thereby violate John Stuart Mill's famous principle that people should be free to do whatever they like, provided they harm no one but themselves. Why? What can justify these paternalistic policies?
Yes, well, we could have a whole entire separate conversation on that issue, and I think there's one of the issues is that if people if people sort of have very poor diets, for example, and become obese and get type 2 diabetes, amongst other things, they impose a huge cost on the rest of society by overburdening the health systems. That's one argument you can use, an economic argument you can use as to why it makes sense for people to be perhaps nudged in the right direction. But we can have a separate conversation on that one, Delia.
Okay. Yeah, I think that was I'll get him to explain how it plays out, but I think that's my point. Living in the UK, thinking about how much I have to pay for the NHS, and if there are how many people are in there to do with directly resulting from alcohol, for example. It's like I have to pay for this, so it does it does affect me. Someone else's choice.
Yeah, that's one of the. We're all there. It's very difficult to, the answer to John Stuart Mill, if that's who you're quoting, is that maybe no man is an island. So anyway, on that note, is there any? We need to wrap up. Any last question you may have, Delia?
No. Well, we didn't cover the whole list, but
all right. Well,
okay.
We've been going for just on an hour, so we'll call an end to it there, and we can have another conversation on the John Stuart Mill question.
Okay.
So
sounds good.
Good night from Melbourne.